and welcome to Connections Radio Show, where we talk about ideas that matter. I'm glad you've made the connection and are with us today. I'm Laurie Fitz, your host, and the goal of our show is really to explore a wide range of topics that get us thinking, get us wondering, get us talking, get us doing something. Ideally, it's a way to see ourselves, our community, and the world around us, and doing something more because we've made the connection. So I am delighted to have two wonderful women join me today to talk about some amazing progress that's being made to support women and to support children and to change the world. I'm going to go as broad as that, but specifically to look at our theater culture and to look at what we've learned from the children's theater and the challenges that it brought, but the revelations and changes that can come out of it as well. So joining me today is Laura Stearns. She is a theater maker. She is going to be doing some stage managing coming up at 6 Points, and she does work on stage and off. She is an actor. She is a writer. She is an advocate for consent culture, and she is a survivor of sexual violence. Shannon Custer is her dear friend and compadre.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
She is an actor, a writer, a theater maker, educator, improviser. She was a group leader in developing educational standards. And you have a show coming up, Full Circle, in November on the Empathy Project. So I want to make sure folks know about that. But also, we're here today to really talk about the Children's Theater alumni wellness, as well as some educational standards that are being developed. And I'd love to start with, Laura, having you share really the history. Now, many people know maybe bits and pieces of the Children's Theater. They've heard it on the news. But I'd love to have you give some context of how this, the history played a role in where you are today in creating a wellness fund.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me back on the show.
Yeah.
It's been a few years since we started having this conversation, and it's great to kind of recap.
Yes.
It's kind of interesting how many people don't really know what happened at Children's Theater, and that history still lives in kind of a shadow.
A hush-hush.
Yeah.
We don't want to talk about that.
That's people don't want to talk about sexual violence, especially when it involves children. Mm-hmm. So I come from the old school at Children's Theater. I was there back in the 1980s, and back in the day, there were a lot of sexual predators at Children's Theater that were allowed to just kind of have free reign on the students.
And they had 20 years up to the point where you joined, where the culture had really been created to be acceptable.
Yeah, 1965 is when John Donahue started the Children's Theater Company. It started out as the Moppet Players and then evolved into Children's Theater. And John was he created an environment that really allowed for sexual predators to thrive, and the culture of otherness that tends to surround theater people really put us into a different category. And there's that specialness that theater people feel anyway, because we're sort of the misfits and the outcasts, or the people who are on the edges.
But it could make you vulnerable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as children, when you find your place, and you find a place where you feel like you belong,
and put on a pedestal to a certain degree.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not just by the people who are watching, but by the people who were teaching us. And then the philosophy that Donahue had was he removed the barriers between adults and children. So the children were treated exactly the same way as the adults were, in good ways and bad ways. And when you remove barriers from young people, it does create space for them to grow beyond what other people would expect them to. Mm-hmm. But the barriers are also safety. Mm-hmm. So the safe element was removed. So we were basically Donahue treated everybody the same in even with humiliation. So he was he sort of ran the show and kept people in line,
which created the complicity. because
Absolutely.
as there was this powerful authoritarian force,
Yes.
there
Yeah.
people became complicit one way or another, and great art was produced.
Absolutely.
Exactly. The performance
Yeah.
of it. I just want to pipe in that when you have these children going on stage and being incredible and looking amazing and in control and beautiful performers,
You're awed.
we think they are healthy, they are fine. Because look what they can do.
Right.
And that is probably the biggest cover of the whole thing.
Well, and when you say that, we talked earlier about the gymnasts. There's this sense of
Yes.
that amazing.
Look what they can do.
Yes, and so we expect them to do that.
Right. We don't think about
Yeah.
the beginning to the moment when the light shines on them. We don't think about that at all. We think about the product because we are so product driven. We are so, look what they are doing that is so exceptional, and how do we keep that going? And so it allows for all kinds of bad behavior. Not just in theater, but, as we were speaking before the show, in sports and community groups and clubs and, for children.
So you recognized at a certain point, but it wasn't until you were much older that you realized that you had been abused.
Absolutely. I was first assaulted when I was 10 years old. So when I showed up at Children's Theater at the age of 13, I was already primed. And, there's a thing that happens with people who are predators. They can read children in particular, and they understand and know who's vulnerable. So that makes you even more of a target. So I was assaulted by Jason McLean, who was a company actor and teacher at Children's Theater when I was 15. And, the thing with people who experience things like that, you do have a sense of responsibility, that you feel like, well, I walked into that house, so therefore I'm responsible. And because we were treated like adults, we thought we were adults. So I didn't really think that a crime had been committed against me. And the thing also with sexual violence at a young age is you hide a lot of that, and there's a shame that goes along with it. So you aren't talking about it. And the harm that happens stays in the shadows, and it will just keep kind of eating away at you, and you don't even necessarily know what's going on because you don't connect the dots.
Right.
And so I didn't even recognize the level of harm until I was much older. And I started going into a therapeutic situation when I was probably close to 30 years old, was the first time I even started talking about. 15 years after I'd been sexually assaulted at Children's Theater was the first time I started talking about it.
Which is common, right?
It's very common.
Yeah, because that is something, too, that is hard to understand from the outside. If you have not been a victim of that kind of violence, you think, well, wouldn't you scream it from the rooftops, or wouldn't you do something? And that is something we leverage against people, and it's so common.
And in my hope in the future, we would be able to.
Right.
But because it's such hidden in the shadows, there's a safety, I think, in staying in the shadows, so that you're not going to be punished. You're not going to not believed. It takes the courage to speak truth to power.
And the thing that's so beautiful about it is when you do speak, it gives other people permission to tell their own stories. And that's sort of the incredible element of it is, you have people coming up from all walks of life all over the place saying something happened to me when I was little, or, even as an adult, and I've never told anybody. And to hear somebody say that is really incredible.
It's a trust, and it's a revelation, and it's an honoring, because it's a sense that I trust you with this that I've carried for so long.
Yeah.
And what kind of beauty is that? That, and to know that there is something that you can offer, especially for folks that were abused by the Children's Theater.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we want to talk about today. Our segment's coming to a close for this one, but I want to have you just do a little overview, and then we'll continue our conversation because it's powerful in our next segment. But tell me a little bit about the ctawellness.org that folks can go to right now if they want to. And then we'll talk more about the history of how this evolved, as well as the theater standards that I know you've been very active with, Shannon.
Yeah.
Yeah, so CTA Wellness is a survivors fund that came out of the settlements with Children's Theater back in 2019. The 17 cases that were filed against CTC or their perpetrators came to a close, and there was an agreement made with Children's Theater to provide $500,000 as seed money for a wellness fund for children who, former children, who were abused at Children's Theater. So that fund is now active, finally, thankfully, and we'll talk more about how people can find out if they're eligible and how to access it.
And that is ctawellness.org. And I take a personal sense of excitement and pride to know that this was something of a vision when we talked about before.
That's right. Yeah.
And it was a great hope and a great to see your vision realized. Just opens my heart. I mean, I just think it's incredible to have that trajectory and to share that experience.
When Gina and I were here together a few years ago talking about it, and that this is a big passion of Gina's, and she's really grateful to be a part of that. She's not here. Unfortunately, today she's out of town, but she would be here talking too.
Yeah. It is, it's exciting and it's powerful, and it will continue to change the world.
And to create a lot of access and healing for people, hopefully.
And maybe set the stage for other organizations to do the same.
Absolutely.
And to be leaders in such a way that it's not just striking the theater community. And if the theater community can be used as an example of how it can be done to make right for others, that's powerful as well. So stay with us. We're going to continue talking about ways to access this fund and way to be part of making changes. Make the connection and make the changes. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. I'm your host, Laurie Fitz, and we have been talking with two incredible women that have been developing new ways of being in our world.
Wow.
I'm just going to go
no
for the
pressure,
big one.
Laurie.
Yeah. No, but seriously, we're looking at the Children's Theater Company, and we're talking about what happened at the Children's Theater Company, the sexual abuse, but it is emblematic of what's happening in our society, and emblematic of how change needs to be made. And this is a pathway that you took to make changes and to lead the way and to open the door to a new way of being in the theater that I dearly hope will be a revelation for folks to think about. How do we just want to be in the world and respect and set up standards and not hide in shadows when especially women and children are abused? Yeah. And you've got a powerful story. Who, if you've just joined us, Laura Stearns will be sharing more about her story in standing up to the Children's Theater Company and helping to lead the way in making changes. She is a theater maker. She's going to be doing some stage managing for 6 Points. She does work on stage, off stage. Worked for years at the Guthrie making wigs and has been absolutely beautiful on stage, creating characters that are mind-boggling and delightful. She's an advocate for the consent culture, and that's really what we're talking about today. She's a survivor of sexual abuse, and she has made a difference for others. Shannon Custer is also a good friend of Laura, but she stands on her own as a wonderful actor, writer, theater maker, does stuff with radio, theater, pilots great stuff. She's an educator, an improviser. She led the group leader. You were leader for the education component for the education standards that we'll be talking about. And you also have a project coming up, Full Circle. You'll be performing with the Empathy Project.
Yes, that'll be over at Park Square Theater. We're excited.
That's exciting. We're also ultimately wanting to let the audience know about the Children's Theater Alumni Wellness. And there is a website that you can go to, ctawellness.org. And we're talking about how that sort of beginning with the end in mind. That's what's available. But during the show today, we're really going to be talking about what led up to that. And in the first segment, we talked about the early days of the Children's Theater, the culture, the complicity, the challenges. Eventually, there was an investigation and a lawsuit.
Right. The Minnesota Child Victims Act was written into law in 2013. And what happened at that time was a 3-year window, a retroactive window was open so that anyone who had been abused prior to that as a child anywhere in the state of Minnesota could come forward with a civil suit. So in 2015, I came forward because of my own sexual assault. But also because I knew there were so many other people who had been assaulted at Children's Theater and that there were so many other people. I didn't know how many perpetrators there were, and it turned out that there were more than 30 people who were perpetrating against children at Children's Theater. So I filed a lawsuit. It ended up going to trial in January of 2019. Shannon was there in the gallery, so I had her eyes to look on. The result of that was that Children's Theater was found negligent for their participation, not found liable, but were found negligent, and that's a whole other story we could talk about.
Yes.
But what happened after that, what really catapulted me into this next phase of really moving into an advocacy place, it was that CTC did a thing called, they filed a motion for taxation of cost, which was that they tried to get the court to agree to allow me to be presented with a bill for almost $300,000 worth of their trial fees. So at that point, I just said, I'm done playing nice. I had, cooperated in every way possible. I was,
music.
oh yeah, and so I basically, threw my gloves off, and I called for a boycott, which is, I think, one of the first times that you and I had a conversation was during that period of time. And what that did was struck a chord finally in the theater community, because back in the 80s when these things came forward, when Donahue was arrested, the theater community really didn't, they just went, oh, well, that's what happens, and when Donahue came out of jail, they welcomed him back into the theater community and everything just sort of went away.
When I came back to the Twin Cities after grad school to work professionally, I remember very clearly there was a few people I worked with who said, yeah, I don't really want my kids to be there. There's some history there. But, and this isn't anything against the people who were just saying this, but that was the culture. Like, well, it happened.
Shrug. That's the thing. Yeah. So,
and I'm sure they've taken care of it, so I'm not going to worry about it.
Right. And we don't want to, stir the pot, whatever, fill in your, saying
and
here.
When you say taking care of, yes, at CTC, they had some policies and stuff in place, but I was on staff at the Guthrie at the time that this happened, and at that time, they did not have a child protection policy at the Guthrie. At the Guthrie Theater, like one of the biggest theaters in the country, didn't have a child protection policy. So they created one because of me coming forward and that I worked there. Had I not worked there, I don't know that they would. I mean, who knows?
Sure.
So this is...
Or just any voice that says this is important. I mean, who is stepping forward and acknowledging this needs to be done.
Right. So that was, for me, a huge eye-opener to recognize that you can even have policies in place that say, we're not going to tolerate certain behavior, but a policy isn't going to protect anybody. It's people who protect people. Right. So we have to...
and if the policy doesn't have any strength, it's not going to be ignored. It will be ignored.
And if it doesn't exist at all, then there's nothing you could do.
Exactly.
So that summer when that happened, I called together a group of theater artists, mostly people who are leaders of theater companies that I knew because I've worked around town for so long and know so many different people. And there was about maybe 15 of us that got together and just said, something needs to happen. We need to do something so that this kind of, and I don't mean the stuff that CTC did with the taxation of costs, but that the behavior and the harm that is happening in the theater community, we need to address it. We need to look right at it and name it. And there was so much harm happening. At the Guthrie Theater, there was a woman who came forward in the scene shop who had been experiencing harassment in the scene shop there, and she made a very public outcry, and there were other people who, like, she left that job, and
left the job,
and another person in the scene shop left in solidarity with her to say, hey, this is a problem, and nobody's really addressing it and paying attention. So that called me to really want to
Advocate
and bring people together, because me by myself going, hey, something needs to change. I can say I can get on the radio with Laurie Fitz and say some things, but that's it's not really going to make huge change. So it was really striking a chord with the community, and that's what was the instigator for what now is the theater safety standards.
Take it away from when something bad happens, this is what you do, and start focusing in on let's not have the bad thing happen.
Prevention.
Right. Yes.
Let's change the culture.
Yes.
Right.
And then also the idea of accountability. Like, that's just not something that people move towards. It's like the 4-letter word nobody wants to speak. So what would it look like if people actually moved towards accountability instead of away from it? And that's what we're trying to accomplish with the Minnesota Theater Safety Standards. And that's what Shannon has been working on with me. And then a large part of that, these kinds of documents exist in other cities. Like Chicago has one, Cleveland, New York, LA. And those documents are mostly representing and addressing issues with performers, and they don't really talk about people in production areas, and they do not talk about theater education, and it's a huge problem. And I would love to hear Shannon talk about what the importance of making sure that children who are being taught, and not just young children, but our young adults moving into the theater profession and not having an understanding of what the expectations are.
And we're going to create a little bit of a theater cliffhanger.
I love those. And then
I know you do. I know you do it with your radio dramas. Then we're going to have a little radio drama.
Lobby, yeah.
Because, of course, I've already blown through this segment. I would love to have you just give an overview, but we're going to feature your perceptions and work and perspectives of why this is so important in our next segment. But at least give us a quick overview of what the work is, and then we'll talk more about it in our next segment.
I think what makes it so important that Laura was talking about was, for people in theater, many begin their careers literally when they're children. And even if it's something you do for fun, this is where you learn how theater works.
Even in a high school production,
how
right?
theater works. You just that's how. And so the discomfort or any sort of trauma, anything that happens that is not healthy becomes industry standard, and so therefore you are, in a sense, primed to continue taking this abuse because you have not been told that that is not the way it should feel or be.
Or allowed to question.
Exactly.
Because of
the way then you're not going to get hired.
Right. Well, the show must go on, and you have to suffer for your art. These old adages still live today, and our young people think that that's the way it's supposed to be, and they don't recognize that they actually have a voice.
And we'll be talking about how you're going to support their voice as well as proactive instead of reactive ways.
Yes.
To set guidelines, to set people up for success, versus to try and help them after there's been, horrible instances that should never have happened. So let's clean it up, and let's set the stage, as I said before, for others to consider it as well. So stay with us. We'll learn more about the theater standards and progressive ways of looking at keeping it safe for children, especially. And then I want to make sure you all know to go to CTA wellness.org. If you know of someone, if you yourself want to access the funds, talk about it. Let people know. We need to spread the word that this is an important fund available for folks who need support, and we want to be there for them. Make the connection. Thanks. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. I'm your host, Laurie Fitz, and we've been talking about the Children's Theater and a Children's Theater Alumni Wellness Fund. And I have Laura Stearns, who is a theater maker. She's stage managing a show coming up at 6 Points. She's a writer, and especially I admire her for her advocate for a consent culture. And we've been talking about what she what she did in standing up to children's theater and how it evolved into eventually a fund to help support children's theater survivors of victims of abuse. So tell me about where the fund is allocated to go and what are the guidelines?
Right. So, like I said earlier, there was a lot of abuse happening between 1965 and 1986. So the fund is for former students who were and not just students, but child performers. They didn't have to necessarily be a student. There were a lot of access points for CTC. Sometimes they were working backstage, or they were in an urban arts summer theater program that was connected to the theater. There were lots of different ways people can connect. So there were also so many people abusing children that, unfortunately, there are very likely hundreds of people who will be eligible for this fund. So the fund is created as a support for the mental and physical well-being of survivors of emotional, physical, and sexual violence at children's theater. And if you go to the website, there are some eligibility there's an
Standards,
eligibility
right.
statement,
Yeah.
right? So it's basically anybody who was 19 years or younger when they arrived. That's the main reason, the main qualifier.
Because you're
right?
focusing on
Yes,
children.
exactly. So and the thing that most people don't really understand, I think, about the way that sexual violence affects people is you don't always connect the dots about how you've been affected. And because children compartmentalize things and they put them in categories that so that they can cope with it, they'll have coping skills that work really well in the moment. And then 10 years down the road, 15, 20 years down the road, those coping skills no longer work, but you aren't connecting the dots and understanding the genesis of the problem. So you may have relationship issues or work issues or, sexual incompetence, there's all kinds of things that can happen, and you don't recognize the reason for it. So we have a group of us who were former litigants, also some just former students, worked together over the last year and a half with a group of therapists from the Center for Emotional Healing, the Center for Trauma and I can't remember the acronym. The Midwest Center for Trauma and Emotional Healing. There it is. Okay. And these group of therapists work in more of a somatic way, and they really try to understand how trauma lives in the body and help survivors understand how trauma lives in the body. So they're a really great resource, and we spent a lot of time training them and getting them to understand the complexity of the community trauma that happened at CTC, and that it wasn't just that people were inappropriately touched. There was a lot of inappropriate behavior emotionally, and so we wanted them to be able to, when you've experienced something like what we did at CTC, it's very difficult to describe. And if you haven't experienced it yourself, you almost don't even really want to bring it up with anybody because people just don't get it. Even therapists don't understand what happened. So these folks are trained in trauma, and not every therapist is trained in complex trauma. So they have now a history, or they understand the history, so that when people call in, the callers don't have to explain the situation. And so now they have a context, they have a container where they can go in and feel understood, so that the therapists are going to help them find the resources that they need. And sometimes
navigate,
those resources,
essentially.
Yeah, and sometimes those resources aren't traditional, like therapeutic modalities, because not everybody does well sitting in a room with a therapist doing talk therapy. Sometimes people need to go
move.
to be a equestrian therapy, go work with horses, or there's all kinds of ways that people can find healing and move that trauma energy through your body. That's what we're hoping to do, is help people move trauma. And so that's what that's what the fund is for, is to help people find resources, and not just financially have the resources, but these folks, and no matter where they are, we've got phone lines that are accessible across the country, across the world, because people scatter and go wherever they need to feel safe. So they can call from wherever, and our application consultants will help them find resources wherever they are.
And I sense one of the ways that you've been working on your own healing is to setting up and being supportive of the educational standards, so that the future
completely
individuals don't have to face what you faced.
Yeah, it's a derivative, or it's a natural progression from what I've experienced, to make sure that other people don't have to have gone through the same kind of thing, that there are resources and standards set up already.
To protect children.
Yes.
And Shannon, I didn't do a formal introduction at the beginning, but I want to make sure Shannon led educational aspects of the standards. Actor, writer, theater maker, educator.
Friend
amazing,
of Laura.
Friends of Laura.
How all my resumes.
And it should be. It should be.
It should be.
But tell me more about the process for you in setting up those educational standards.
Yeah, it was very exciting. I co-directed that particular segment of the education with a very renowned actor in town named Stephen Yoakum, and we got together with the leadership of the entire organization of MNTAC, and talked about what our experiences were like. That so many performers, stage managers, designers have been through some sort of training, whether it's theater summer camp or MFA programs or you name it. And what we discovered was that education within the world of theater is so varied, and it can look so many different ways. It can be a one-off class in a library, or it could be a 6-year intensive program. And at the heart of it were so many commonalities, such as that cult of personality, or if you had a question or you felt unsafe, you need to be quiet, or you're not being a good team member, or you're not taking care of your partner, and it creates a breeding ground for some bad behavior, not to be
and for many years, I have to say, it's been a very male-dominated.
Absolutely.
And it has not. It's only recently, I think, I've seen really good female directors be able to hold their own
and be recognized.
Yeah, exactly. And women's voices were very often subjugated, to the overall male-dominant culture.
And I think what we really came to was that we love this art form, and it needs to do better, and that's become almost oversaid now. But one of the things that really struck us was that theater as a tool, not even if that's not what you're going to do for your life, but theater as a tool can be, just transformative to young people, to teach them to use their voice and storytelling. And if they enter our world, just to get to proprietary about it, but if they enter our world, then they better be safe. That there better be,
because we're welcoming them into a very a vulnerable place where in true theater, as you're looking at transformation, you open yourself up entirely.
Absolutely.
And it's the most vulnerable profession I know. I can't think of anything else that's like it.
Yeah, it's raw.
And physical, mental, it's all parts of you.
And we want these young people to understand not just that things should be safe, but they have the right to safety and what to expect in those spaces, that they don't have to accept unacceptable behavior from people just because they're in a position of power. Mm-hmm. And Shannon mentioned MNTAC, that acronym.
Yeah,
I just want to say what that is.
I was sounded fancy there tonight.
The Minnesota Theater Accountability Coalition, and that is the group of people that came together to create the Minnesota Theater Foundational Standards for Safety and Accountability. That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is a mouthful, but it has an acronym, so it's legit.
So do theaters adapt and say, yes, we accept these standards, or is this something that you're working on that is going to be hopefully enforced? I mean, what do you do with the guidelines?
Oh my gosh, that's a big
Such
question.
a
It's
good question.
such a good question. Right now, we're at the stage of we've written the standards, and they are going to be launched on the website, which is mntac.org,
Very good.
mntac.org. And those will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And on October 11th, we're going to be doing a Facebook Live sort of walkthrough of the standards so that people can see what they're all about. And what we're hoping for is that both artists and organizations will sign on to this document and say, we support it, we endorse it. And eventually, we're hoping that there will be an element of oversight because through the conversations that we had, there were 4 things that rose to the surface that were major concerns in theater, just as an industry, but also in education, and that is safety, accountability, oversight, and transparency.
Oh, you did it. I was like, what's that last?
Yeah, I know. My brain was going,
Well,
find it.
as a theater goer, I would love to see the standards, if they accept it, on their website.
Yes,
so that when I'm making my choices about where to go to theater, I want to see it on the program.
Thank you.
So that I can be proud of the show that I'm supporting, knowing that they have kept these standards.
You're my favorite person right now for saying that. That is right. And it should be that everybody knows about them. And that are you a MnTAC theater?
Yes.
Do
and
you
that's
follow
true
the standards?
For, a stage manager or a light operator says, I would like to know if this particular theater has...
Because that's where I want to invest my entertainment dollars.
That's
is
right.
a place that I feel good about how they created the art. Not just the art,
but
but
the
how is the
institution
art
cares
created.
enough to follow those standards and say... And we all know that things don't go perfectly. And that things are going to... But if you have a process in place and you say, here's what's going to happen when, not if, when things don't go properly... Here's the structure.
And it's something that theater should feel proud of.
Yes.
And take pride that they are. Of course, I've run over. So we're going to
just keep talking.
We do. We'll need to take, but when we come back, I do want to talk about how people can invest in this program, how they can support the good work that you're doing, and what's next. So stay with us. We'll be right back for a very short fourth segment. Welcome back to Connections Radio Show. Thank you for being with us today. It's been a great conversation. We've had Laura Stearns, who is a theater maker, stage manager, a actor, a writer, behind the scenes, and today sharing her story as an advocate for the consent culture of the future. She's a survivor of sexual violence and has been sharing her story about Children's Theater Company. And I am so proud that she is here to talk about that. Just because you've been on the show a few times, and each time you've put out there a vision of what you'd like to see.
And it's happening. It's starting to happen. Yeah.
Yes. And the standards was a dream of yours.
Yeah. The Minnesota Theater Safety Standards is coming to life, and it's pretty incredible. It feels like a new shift, like there's a new wind in town.
Exactly. And Shannon Custer's been also sharing her work on the theater standards and also your dream for the future.
Yeah.
And what it should look like and how it should look like.
Because we love theater. It just needs to be safer, better, and it will be because of this.
Mm-hmm. And you care about kids.
Oh, yeah. Because eventually, they're going to hire me. I need them. I need them to be healthy and strong.
Right. Hold safe spaces for me when I'm 60, 70.
And in this segment, I do want to have the folks that are out there that are going, this is important. How can I help?
Yeah.
So I want to be able to open this up to how can they help? What are ways that the audience who've been moved by what you're doing, how you're doing it, share with us what can they do?
Well, for the CTA Wellness Fund, that is the fund for the alumni of children's theater that were harmed back between 1965 and 1986, there is a donate page on the website, which is ctawellness.org. And, we had an initial donation of $500,000 from Children's Theater through the settlement process after the cases were finally settled that were filed against them. And $500,000 sounds like a lot, but not when you consider the amount of people who are actually eligible for this fund, because we are talking a lot of people. So please go to the website and donate, and even $20 is great, but if you got more, that's great too.
And if you know someone that was at the Children's Theater,
Yes.
or you yourself were at the Children's Theater,
yes, yeah,
please
go
go.
to the website
Yeah.
and check it out. And again, people don't always understand how they were harmed at the time, and hopefully the narrative that we worked so hard on in the website to show the levels of experience. And another piece of this that's so complicated is when we were working there was so much joy involved in what we were doing as well. And so the trauma piggybacks on joy. And it's really hard to separate them. So people have a hard time holding multiple truths. And the truth is, there were aspects of my experience at Children's Theater that were incredible and made me who I am today as an artist. So how do you separate those things?
And not feel guilty.
And does the one thing cancel the other? No, they don't. They both get to exist.
But you can help right the wrong for others.
You can find the ways that the things that work, that are still working for you today, and take them with you, and let go of the things that don't. And that's what we're trying to make really clear on the website, is that everybody's experience is valid, and we want everybody to just be where they are, and we're going to meet people where they are.
You have a statement on the website that just moved me to tears in terms of having folks understand where you're coming from. We value, respect, and support each person's timing for healing and being in charge of one's own process. Everyone has the right to take time to move forward at an individual pace while being held with tenderness and care.
Yeah.
And that applies to us all. It's for the Children's Theater survivors.
Yep.
But I truly hope that as we hear this and as we talk about it and as we think about it, how can we take this and move it forward? What does this look like for our society?
Yeah, and you can look at that website and see what our experience is, and then also recognize that there may have been things that happened in your own life that are like, well, maybe that's not exactly what I thought it was, and maybe I need to investigate this and see it in a different way. And then for the Minnesota Theater Safety Standards, go to mintac.org and check that work out.
Yeah, it's so exciting. We were just talking in the break that we are writing these for theaters and theater artists, but audience members, community members out there who want a safer community, check it out, sign on.
And support it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there will be a page on the website for people to endorse and sign on to the safety standards.
So one takeaway that's easy to do: get onto that page and make that signature. Do it, make the connection, and make a difference. Thanks so much for being with us today and sharing the journey with these two wonderful women.